Okay, the computer crashed as I was doing the cellular respiration discussion. And so I double checked the section of that video after rebooting the computer, and it did complete my discussion of cellular respiration in most of its entirety, but it didn't record the last part about the actual chemical equation, which is almost the reverse of photosynthesis. So we take the sugar that was either produced by a plant, or if you trace it back, it eventually has to go back to a plant at some point. All food energy that we eat with almost insignificant, not almost, completely insignificant amounts of energy that could come from other sources rather than the sun. But almost all energy comes from the sun and plants or algae, photosynthesis. And so whether that energy is stored as sugar, as starch, as protein, as fats, eventually we eat it or something else eats it, and then we eat that something else, and our body converts that into sugar through the digestive processes. And once it's converted to sugar, it is put into our bloodstream and sent out to the rest of the cells in our body as glucose. And now glucose is chemically stored energy that can be stored for a long time. And so one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, don't forget about subscripts if you write this, and don't forget how to spell glucose, but one of these glucose molecules is burned with 6 sugars. Now it's reacted with, it's not technically burning. In order to have this chemical reaction occur without special enzymes or protein catalysts that help this reaction go along, it would require high temperatures that would be incompatible with life, more like the temperatures of fire. And the proteins that catalyze our digestion of sugars and the breakdown of sugars to release the energy allow this to happen at much lower temperatures in the 90s. In the 80s even, you can burn sugar with enzymes, and it just becomes much less efficient at lower temperatures. So I take oxygen, react it with glucose, 6 oxygens specifically, and it creates, the right-hand facing arrow, 6 carbon dioxides that we breathe out, and 6 waters, which we also mostly breathe out. The biggest weight loss organ in our body is our lungs. Most of what you eat goes in your mouth and into your stomach, and eventually it comes out your lungs as carbon dioxide gas and water vapor. Only a small portion of that you excrete in the bathroom, the undigested material or excess water for urination to get rid of other toxins that are byproducts of our digestion system. So in the process of doing this chemical reaction, burning glucose with oxygen, we also create ATP, the same ATP that is in the Calvin cycle for photosynthesis. ATP can drive all kinds of reactions, but now this ATP can drive reactions in my body or in a plant cell or in a fish or a fungus or any other organism's cells that need energy to do any kind of work. I can move my fingers, I can jump up and down, I can talk to you, I can do all kinds of things because of the energy in ATP. And so that energy is now being used. So it's not exactly the opposite of the photosynthesis reaction that you see here at the bottom of your screen, but memorize this. The only difference is instead of having light energy, which goes into the photosynthesis reaction, we have ATP energy coming out the other end. in the cellular respiration equation you see on the screen right now. And in addition, instead of having 12 waters on one side, 6 on the other, we don't have that same kind of a situation where we have water on both sides. We just have 6 waters on the other side of the equation, on the right-hand side of the equation. 1 glucose plus 6 oxygens makes 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters with some ATP energy to do work in the cells. Plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, unless they're non-photosynthetic plants like certain parasites. But most plants photosynthesize and cellular respiration. All other organisms do some sort of cellular respiration. Now, there are some unusual organisms that can use some other chemical energy, such as certain bacteria that live off of chemical energy stored in rocks. And that's a very rare situation in terms of the total amount of biological energy in planet Earth that's being processed. Almost all of the biological energy is based on these 2 equations in one way or very close to these 2 equations in life, or it traces back to these equations at some point in the energy's history. So learn those 2 equations. So how do plants capture energy from sunlight? Well, first of all, you need to understand that sunlight releases its energy in the form of these packets of energy, these waves or packets of energy called photons. And there are many, many different energy levels of photons, and only a small fraction of that we call visible light. So these high energies of many different wavelengths comprise the electromagnetic spectrum. And that includes all kinds of photons from extremely high energy to extremely low energy, but they all are photons. They all travel at the speed of light. They all are waves. The only thing that differs is in their wavelength. So at the very, very shortest wavelengths, you have the highest energy, and they're going through their wave motion much more quickly, and their wavelength can be down in the thousandths of a nanometer. And a nanometer is already a billionth of a meter, so a thousandth of a billionth of a meter is a trillionth of a meter. That's pretty darn small. And so these are very high energy. They go right through certain substances. We have things like gamma rays and X-rays and UV light, which are all high energy photons. We don't see those, but we can use those for research, medical, and other purposes. UV light, a very good sterilizing agent, also an unfortunate source of cancer production in human skin cells. But we need UV light. It also produces vitamin D in our skin from cholesterol under the surface of our skin. And we need vitamin D. How do we get vitamin D? Modest exposure to sunlight. And so we need that UV light to do that. And then here, this tiny little wedge, which is expanded, is what we call visible light. These wavelengths from about 400 nanometers up to about 740 nanometers are wavelengths that interact directly with the pigments in the back of our eye called retinal. Retinal is the pigment in our retinas, and retinal will react. Its electrons will interact with the photons, and when the electrons of the retinal molecules in the back of our eyes, when the electrons are struck by wavelengths of light in this 400 to 740 range, it triggers a signal that is sent to our brain, and we perceive that as vision. So that's what we call visible light, human visible light. Now, if you're an insect, you might see down into the UV range. You might see quite a different range of frequencies of electromagnetic photons, depending on what organism you are. Dogs are sometimes wrongly believed to be colorblind, and that's not true. They don't see as thoroughly in the full color spectrum of what we call the visible light spectrum, but they can distinguish colors. They just can't distinguish all of the colors we do. You go into the infrared, and you're going into the lower wavelengths of, or not lower wavelengths, lower energy wavelengths of light. And so they're longer waves, a little more lazy, although how can you call it a lazy wave when it's traveling at the speed of light? But these can be on the order of millimeters in size, and we have those interact with our tissues in ways that cause warmth or heat to be developed. The interaction of those photons with the electrons of our shirts, our skin, converts it to heat energy. So we consider those infrared heat waves. Then there are microwaves that we use to cook our food, and radio waves, the longest radio waves being the AM radio waves listed here, very long, in the order of a wavelength can be an entire football field. But remember, this wave is traveling at a speed that would go around the entire Earth 7 times a second. So it's traveling pretty fast. So even though 100 meters is a long wavelength, it's still traveling at an extremely high rate of speed. But they have different properties, and so we use these different electromagnetic photons for different purposes. Everything from, you know, radio communications, cooking our food, radar systems, being able to see, photography, visible light, interactions, research, x-rays, you name it. All of this is the electromagnetic spectrum. But it's just that teeny tiny little thing in the middle, the visible light, that we call that visible light that we see because we interact with it directly. Now, pigments are molecules that absorb light. So I have a black shirt on at the moment because it's absorbing a lot of light. And there's a white pattern on this shirt because it's reflecting most of the light. Therefore, it's white. And, you know, there's a little bit of this yellowish green color on my shirt. Science is awesome. And this yellowish green color is because it's reflecting the yellow wavelengths, but absorbing the other wavelengths. So the reflected light is what we see. So as we saw in the previous illustration, it's somewhere in the 380 to 750 range that our human pigment retinal can absorb. It absorbs all of the visible light that we can see. In plants, plants are green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll comes in 2 major groups or flavors, if you will, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they have slightly different shapes of their molecules, and so they absorb light slightly differently, but they both are greenish in color. So if we look at the absorption spectra of chlorophyll A, the one here with the highest peak on the right-hand side, you can see chlorophyll A with this high peak absorbs a lot of light in that red area, and quite a bit in the orange as well. If we follow this line all the way over, we'll also notice that it absorbs a lot of blue light, but it doesn't absorb the yellows and the greens and a little bit of the deeper yellows plus some of the blues. What does blue and yellow come to make? More green. So it's yellow, green, and some leftover deep yellows and blues that make even more green. So that's why plants are green. They're absorbing much of the blue and red light, and they're reflecting the green light and the other light that our eyes perceive as green. Now, different plants have different mixtures of pigments, and so there's lots of different variations on greens and other colors that you see in plants. But you can see why most plants are green, because chlorophyll is green because of the way chlorophyll A absorbs light. Now, chlorophyll B will absorb some more of that orange, taking out some more of that warm color. And chlorophyll B will also absorb more of the blue, squeezing it into the green area, plus a little blue and yellow. What's left? Greens. And so plants look green, not because they're using green light, but because green light is the waste light, the garbage light, the light it can't effectively use. Now, some plants are very slow growing and efficient at handling very low light situations or green light situations if they're living under a deep canopy of leaves at the forest floor. Some plants can survive under all of this when they only see green light, because it is not 100% ineffective. You can have some photosynthesis down here in the greens and yellows. It's just not very efficient. It's not very effective. But some plants with large leaves living on the forest floor, growing relatively slowly in small plants, they can hang out underneath this area and get enough green light. They're adapted to deal with those low light situations. The last line on this graph or chart is carotenoids. Carotenoids are important for our diet. We use carotenoids like carotenes that are the substance for vitamin A and other kinds of related nutritious things when we eat carrots and other types of nutritious vegetables. But they are also important for the colors of leaves that we don't necessarily see a lot of the time, because the carotenoids are overwhelmed and covered by chlorophyll pigments. But in the fall, when the chlorophyll is being disassembled and the leaves are getting ready to drop because of the fall deciduous showy color change, the chlorophyll is lost, but the carotenoids stay behind, and you get the beautiful fall colors of the oranges, yellows, and reds. Because look at the spectrum of the absorption of the carotenoids, this long dotted line. It's getting rid of all the blues and a little bit of the green. And so what are you left with? You're left with some combination of these warmer colors. And that's why you get those warm colors in the fall. Now, this is a very generic graph. There are variations on carotenoids, lots of variations. So different plants have different versions of carotenoids, and so they have different fall colors. So here you see a deciduous oak tree. Some oak trees are evergreen, and they keep their leaves all year long, and they drop their leaves slowly all year long. But other oak trees, they come out with new leaves in the spring, they grow all summer, and then they drop their leaves in the fall. And you can see here, this is not a spectacular color on this particular photograph. Some oak trees are absolutely gorgeous, and I would imagine that this particular oak tree is a gorgeous one, it's just not showing through in the colors on this particular presentation. So, what is a chloroplast? In a plant cell, a chloroplast is an organelle, a subcellular structure that is theorized to be an ancient symbiotic mutualist relationship with a cyanobacteria that has been highly modified over eons into this structure now, and has the membrane structures with the pigment chlorophyll embedded in the membrane of the inner tissues. And so here we have a photograph through microscope of a plant cell showing all of the chloroplasts. That is green or yellowish green in this particular photograph. Up down the left, we have a drawing of that plant cell. On the upper right, we have a breakdown of the actual chloroplast itself. Don't worry about the details of cycloid chromosomes. I'm not too worried about for this class. If you want to botany or histology or some classes like that, you'll need to know a little bit more about the detailed structure. So plants have specialized a tiny little piece of the membranes on one of these cycloid bodies. And look at just these membrane, these little items of chlorophyll in the structure of that membrane. So these pigments are floating around, absorbing all the light except mostly the green light. And it can only absorb so much. I mean, some of the light passes right through. Cells are very small, so light goes right through a lot of the cells and down to the lower leaves, the lower cells. These groupings of chlorophyll molecules form the photosystems. So we have sunlight in, and it strikes the membrane on that cycloid, that inner membrane of the chloroplast. And when it strikes that inner membrane, if it strikes the photosystem, some photons are going to be captured by the pigment. And immediately, as they're captured, they're going to take ADP, D as in dog, ADP, and use energy to tack on another phosphate, ATP. Adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphates, becomes adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphates. Now it's triphosphate. And then that ATP goes to do some work, such as the Calvin cycle, and it drives the chemical reactions of the Calvin cycle. And as it gives up its energy, it breaks the bond of that last phosphate, and ATP becomes ADP, again, a lower energy molecule. And then another photon needs to be captured to add more energy to turn ADP back into ATP. And then ATP does some work back into ADP and back and forth it goes. Every time it's recharged, it needs a photon light. And then it gives up that extra phosphate and giving up the energy to do work back and forth. And the same exact concept is happening with NADPH. These photons of light not only are being used to make ATP, but they're being used to make NADPH, which is reducing power. And when we talk about reducing power, it's a specific kind of reaction. So I have nails, play with nails, and I leave them outside in the rain. What happens? They rust or they oxidize, and turning from iron molecules to rust, which is iron oxide molecules. That is an oxidation reaction. Well, how do we get iron for the nails in the first place? We dig up iron in the soil. Iron-rich soil looks rusty. Why? It's all iron oxide. We don't dig up iron. We dig up iron oxide. And then we have to put it through a special process, a very high-temperature chemical reaction that turns iron oxide back into iron. We reduce iron oxide back to elemental iron. So oxidation is moving in one direction. Energy, actually, oxidation, energy goes down. Reduction, energy in the opposite direction. And so the NADPH provides reducing power for driving the Calvin cycle for certain reactions that require an oxidation reduction type reaction. So ATP is energy like the batteries of the cell. NADPH is the reducing power. And one photon of light can make one ADP turn into an ATP. Another photon of light can turn one NADP plus into an NADPH. Okay? So photons turn these two molecules, ADP and NADP plus, into their energized states, ATP and NADPH. Now they can do work for different kinds of reactions, driving the Calvin cycle. Oh, in order to get the H, where do they get the H's? They have to take water and strip water for its hydrogens. Lots of hydrogens are needed to drive photosynthesis and to make this NADPH. So that's why you need 12 waters. You've got all this water coming in and the water's being disassembled for parts. And in the process, as the hydrogens are being used, for every 2 water molecules, they get 4 hydrogens, and now you got 2 extra oxygens. What do you do with those 2 extra oxygens? Join them together into O2, and now it's waste. Oxygen is released by plants. Plants, or photosynthesis, algae and bacteria, that cyanobacteria that photosynthesize as well, create oxygen. And that's how they do it. So the light-dependent reactions take place in 5 stages. First, light is captured. Then, when that light is captured, the electron that it interacts with is energized or excited. So a photon comes in, hits an electron in the chlorophyll, and that photon that hit an electron in the chlorophyll now excites or energizes, gives up its energy to that electron. So now you have an excited electron. So here you have a photon coming in, it strikes the chlorophyll, it interacts with an electron, and when it interacts with that electron, it gives up its energy to the electron, and now you have an excited electron. That electron then goes through the electron transport system. Just like wires in your house, when you have excited electrons, you can do all kinds of things. You can run the blender, run the toaster, run your vacuum cleaner. You can do anything you want that you can plug into the wall with excited electrons. They can do work, right? But you need to get that electron from point A to point B. How do you do that? Wires. Well, they don't have wires in the cell. They have electron transport system or chemical structures that pass the electron along very similarly that you would pass on electrons in your house through wires. And now the electron that is moving through the electron transport system is providing the impetus to do work. It is now doing something, and that something is taking ADP and a phosphate and putting them together to make ATP. The energy needed to rejoin that bond is being provided by the excited electron. And similarly, another photon is needed to make NADPH out of NADP+. So here you can see the reaction. A photon comes in, it excites an electron. That electron goes through the electron transport system. In the process, a proton gradient is made, water is being stripped for its hydrogens, and ATP is being made. So water is needed to be stripped for its protons. Don't worry about the details of how this happens or why. Another photon comes in, another electron is excited, and it goes through another electron transport system, and a NADPH is made. Plants use two photosystems, photosystems 2 and 1, that occur in series, one right after the other. And they make the ATP and NADPH in a process called non-cyclic photophosphorylation. I'm not going to worry about photophosphorylation. Don't worry about that word. And which one is photosystem 1 and which one is photosystem 2. I'm not going to ask you that on a test. Just the fact that you've been exposed to it, good. If you go on to other things, it'll be much easier to remember if you're going on further into plant biology. And that is it for photosynthesis part 1.